Hello everyone, this is Aegon of Astora, and welcome back to Bloodborne Let's Talk Lore. This is episode 21, being recorded on Monday the 22nd of February. I hope you're all having a fantastic day, whenever it is you find yourself watching this. So I mentioned in the previous episode that we would be wrapping up all of the loose ends from the DLC, but there were two very important ones that I forgot, or at least one very important one that we forgot, which is this one here. So this is the set piece that JSF mentioned in episode 19. And, yeah, it's not a pretty sight. Not a pretty sight at all. And you'll notice that the corpse model there is specifically a hunter corpse model. And recall that as we established earlier on in the series, there were only a few generic types of corpses. When a corpse is supposed to be that of a hunter, this is the only that's the only set we see on that corpse model. Just as in, for example, Yahar'gul, when we pick up the Yahar'gul set off of one of the people who were on, an apparent driver of one of the buggies there. Yeah, even though it's the Yahar'gul hunter set, they are wearing it's the same corpse model. Harrowed hood, garb, gloves, and trousers. Certain church hunters obfuscate their identities and slip into the nooks and crannies of the city. This is the garb that allows these harrowed individuals to go unnoticed. These hunters are keen to early signs of the scourge, serving as a first line of defense against its outbreak. Or perhaps, when the time is ripe, they find signs of the scourge where there are none. It just goes to show the corner beggar is not always who he seems. So that last line there, I think is very interesting in that I believe it was Redgrave who first made the connection between this set, and specifically the Harrowed Hood, and the Afflicted Beggar. And specifically the very last sentence in the item description, which says, it just goes to show the corner beggar is not always who he seems. And I can't recall in which of Redgrave's videos it was, but he, makes the I think apt observation that this would seem to also be, or in particular to be, because it could be just a general thing, but also that last sentence, a particular reference, a specific reference to the Afflicted Beggar, who in turn, the rest of the evidence as Redgrave presents it, and I think I agree with this, would seem to suggest that the Afflicted Beggar is in fact one irreverent Izzy. And yeah, that's very interesting, but the other question that this corpse raises is, yeah, who is it? And that scared me for a second. I thought this fisherman was alive again. So, whoever it was, they met a very horrible and well, I don't know if I would say untimely death, but certainly a horrible death. at the hands of this fishman here. And again, it's really hard to say, because I'm just... that this isn't just something... this isn't just Simon's garb. It's specifically one that belongs to what seems to be almost like an espionage arm of the Healing Church. It doesn't say, you know, like, it doesn't specifically place them into a faction like, say, the Healing Church like the Choir or the School of Mensis, sort of a sub-faction within the church, but just that certain church hunters wear these to conceal their identities, so that they can, you know, kind of go undercover, in a sense. So Simon is one of those hunters, and the Afflicted Beggar, it would seem, is also one of those hunters. This could just be another generic person, so that's probably the most likely... that would seem to be, to me, to be the most likely explanation, that this is just another one of those Harrowed hunters, that it's not meant to be anyone in particular, and that it's just a way of, you know, giving us that additional lore, but also of fleshing out who Simon is and his story, and of giving us the you know, gear that he was wearing, because he uses the same, you know, hand lantern as us. So, you know, he is, in a sense, like an analog to the player. But an additional possibility, and one that is probably less likely, but I think is interesting, is that this is also Simon. That, in the same way that if we were to go to the lighthouse hut lamp, I believe Simon's body is still there, even after he dies. And so, you know, there's precedent there for a body being there and remaining there after that person has died within the Hunter's Nightmare. And Simon also does mention in his dialogue that, you know, it happens, this is happening over and over again. It never ends. So maybe this is a previous iteration of Simon? That this particular Simon didn't even make it to the lighthouse hut. He, you know, he faced his end here, at the hands of these two very crafty fishermen with the cleavers. So it's one that would create a whole series of and essentially would make the lore of Bloodborne very similar to how I conceive of the lore in Dark Souls 2, as being, you know, a story of multiverses, and how, where and how and whether the multiverses converge upon one another, you know, in a long view evolutionary sort of way. And so, you know, it's not one that I think is really likely, but I think it's interesting that this could be. But then the obvious question that it would raise in turn from there would be, well, why don't we find a whole bunch of corpses with the Harrowed Set on it? Various different places where the Harrowed Hunter, Simon, the Seeker of Secrets, has the various places where he's died. Because if indeed this has been going on forever, or maybe the court, you know, there is a one corpse limit in terms of the number of cycles that repeat themselves. I don't know. It's an idea that certainly has a lot of holes in it, but I think is very interesting nevertheless. And there was something, the other loose end was, I noticed this almost immediately after I stopped recording the previous episode. And I noticed it because I came over to the Bath Messenger here, and was looking through the various weapons and whatnot to see if there's anything I needed to buy, or that I should spend my hundreds of thousands of more or less useless echoes on at this point. And I realized that I had not yet picked up the piercing rifle on any of my builds. This is the one DLC weapon I have yet to actually have, because during my blind playthrough I went and I looked at the item description and looked at kind of what it seemed to be, and just said, meh, I'm happy with my hunter's pistol, just my plain old hunter's pistol. But the item description for this reads, and we pick this up after we get the firing hammer badge. A rifle engineered by the Auto Workshop, the precursor to the workshop of the heretical powder kegs. Designed for hunting on narrow streets, this rifle has been optimized to cause perforation wounds, but is unfit for reliably countering attacks. So that last part of the sentence there was pretty much what guaranteed that I would never buy it, other than in the context of this playthrough. Old Hunter's Essence. So yeah, as I mentioned, I've played through the DLC several times, but I've never actually bought that rifle, so I didn't realize that that was the only thing I needed to do in order to get the last trophy I would need for Bloodborne. So yeah, so we already have the description for that, but we might as well... I'm interested just to see what it actually functions like. Yeah... It's interesting, but again, maybe I'm just boring, or pistol's only at +7. Maybe I'm just boring or you know, vanilla or whatever, but I just really enjoyed the standard pistol. And I'm okay with that. So we've not been here in quite some time. And things more or less look to be in the same place where we left them, where everyone's just not doing very good at all, and my former confidant, the lovely but lonely old dear, her body is still unfortunately there. And there's nothing really we can do about that, but and Ariana is still in a non-communicative state.
Oh, there you are. Forgive me, I'm a bit out of sorts. So, no blood today, I'm afraid.
I was thinking more about Adela, who is more or less in an uncommunicative state, but Ariana is certainly not herself right now. But we will return to that a little bit later on. So recall in a much earlier episode, we discussed the upper echelons of the church, and we learned that it consists of the healing church, it consists of the choir and the school of Mensis. The latter of which is based out of Yahargul, the unseen village, which we visited, I believe it was in episode 8 or episode 7, Hail of the Nightmare. And that we will be returning to either in the next episode or the episode after that. The former of the two, the choir, is based out of the Upper Cathedral Ward, where we are currently headed. So recall that we made a quick run to Yahargul, the Unseen Village, in the post-Blood Moon phase, to pick up the Upper Cathedral Ward key, the description for which reads... The key to the Upper Cathedral Ward seal. The upper echelons of the Healing Church are formed by the School of Mensis, based in the Unseen Village, and the choir, occupying the Upper Cathedral Ward. This key brings one a step closer to the choir. So something very, very interesting about this baby celestial here is that, and several of the other baby celestials in the area, is that it is seemingly, they all seem to face in the direction of where Ebertos is. And this came to my attention while listening to an episode of Bonfireside Chat, I believe the episode in which they discussed the Upper Cathedral Ward. And the guest on that particular episode was one Allison Baker, who has a Tumblr page called Lego Dark Souls, so the link to which will be in the description. And Allison, she posted, in the episode she discussed this, but she also posted a link to it on her Tumblr, which includes several really well done screenshots showing how these Celestials, they seem to be longing after Ebertos, their kin, in more ways than one, I suppose. And so what Allison wrote specifically is, the children of the orphanage just want to get home to their mom. As I pointed out in my guest appearance on Bonfireside Chat, these little guys in the Upper Cathedral Ward all seem to be trying to get to the Grand Cathedral. We know from playing that the cathedral is where the Left Behind Great One, Ebertos, Daughter of the Cosmos, is located. Presumably they are trying to get to her. So that's a really cool little touch, I think. So it's not the pale fluid that it spits out, much like Ebertos does during that boss fight. But it's direct contact with the... I had to test it a couple times there, just to make sure that that's what it was. See, it's not that liquid or fluid that it's spitting out, but it's being bit. It's when you allow the baby celestial to munch on you. Blue elixir. So recall, we've read this a number of times, but it bears repeating. Dubious liquid medicine used in strange experiments conducted by high ministers of the healing church, a type of anesthetic that numbs the brain. The guy with the lantern with the eyeballs, that isn't a set of attacks, or I guess a variation on that enemy type that you see, I believe, when you're above 25 insight, no matter where they are. But the guys up here, the church servants up here, actually have that attack no matter what. They always have it. So that's very interesting, because previously with the not being able to see that with lower insight, they were somehow protected from that knowledge by having lower insight, by not being as intelligent. And so that raises questions as to whether that's because if these guys, I don't know, I have a really hard time squaring the two as to why, even if we have very low insight, we can see those attacks here. And obviously I have 90, so that doesn't necessarily apply to me, but if we came here with a bit of lower insight, then yep, we would still be able to see that. But in the lower Cathedral Ward, we cannot. So there's the Grand Cathedral right there. And once again, as Alison Baker pointed out, all the baby Celestials. Are longing after where Ebertas seems to be. Because, and it's hard to initially, like, at least it was for me, to initially wrap my mind around the geography of this area, but we go through up there, that's the entrance, and then, oh, just keep doing your thing, don't worry about me, I'm just hanging out, please. Okay, so we enter over there, and then we come out up there. That's where we get the make contact gesture. We come back out down there, and then we go along this this walkway sort of thing here, and then we fight the Celestial Emissary there, and then we go into or across the clock tower, and then we descend down to where Ebertas is, somewhere around there maybe. And I don't know if the geography actually reflects that, like the game geography actually reflects that, or if it's just trickery. I know that there's a fair bit of trickery making, of giving the image that something is interconnected even when it's not, in Bloodborne as in other Souls games. And this might be another example of that, which is why it can be confusing, or at least it is for me. But yeah, so Ebertas is somewhere down there. In fact, she is under, so in the same way that we find Lawrence's skull under the altar in the Grand Cathedral, in one of the two Grand Cathedrals in the Nightmare Frontier, the later Grand Cathedral as opposed to the earlier one, that Ebertas is actually in more or less the same spot where we find Lawrence's human skull and the church cannon. So that's very interesting. Another thing I wanted to note as well is that the trees here, they look a fair bit more than the trees at any other point in the game, I think. They look like the arch trees from Dark Souls 1. Never really gotten a good look at the clock face there, because the clock face, as JSF and I discussed previously, that, and this might have been cut out from the final episode, but this image figured very prominently into a lot of the early marketing of the game, of the clock face kind of looming over the city of Yharnam. But then the closer it got to the release, the less prominent it was, suggesting that, yeah, again, that there seems to be, raising questions about cut content and whatnot, so. And so while they can very easily aggro onto you, if you stay at a fair distance and you don't distract them from what it is that they're doing, then they seem to be non-aggressive. And they're not the prettiest things, at least in terms of, you know, maybe it's not really fair to apply human standards of beauty, whatever those may be, to any given individual, but that kind of creeps me out. And I'm trying to figure, like, whether there's an analog in the game for the way their mouths are split. That they have what I want to say 4 different jaws, but I don't even really think that's the right way of putting it. Their mouth is split 4 ways. They have 4 sets of teeth instead of 2 is probably a better way of putting it. And the eye protrusions look a little bit like the barnacles we find stuck to everything. Like, it's not a one-to-one, it's a very kind of loose connection, but we do find an example of that very connection a little bit later on. But we'll get to that when we do. Great Lake. A carol rune that transcribes inhuman sounds. This transcription of the Great One's inhuman voices ripples like a watery reflection. This rune means lake, and those who memorize it enjoy general reduced damage. Great volumes of water serve as a bulwark guarding sleep, and an augur of the eldritch truth. Overcome this hindrance and seek what is yours. Okay, fellas, we're gonna head over this way. And I think we should actually probably replenish our blood vials before we proceed. So now that we've got a fresh stock of blood vials, let's proceed. I am, of course, using the church pick, which I am a huge fan of, as of this moment. Or, as of the moment I started using it, perhaps I should say. So as with the church servant on the bridge back there, the one with the scythe in the lower Cathedral Ward of the Cathedral Ward proper, the scythe won't be buffed unless you have over a certain amount of insight. But this one's scythe is buffed no matter what. The choir set sans the helmet, and once again note that it is just a generic hunter model. Attire of the choir, high-ranking members of the Healing Church. Members of the choir are both the highest-ranking clerics of the Healing Church and scholars who continue the work that began at Bergenworth. Together with the left-behind Great One, they look to the skies in search of astral signs that may lead them to the rediscovery of true greatness. So, the reference here to the left-behind Great One, and that was also something that I read out as part of Allison's Tumblr post that we just discussed previously, that these references to, and in the trophies as well, to Ebertos being a Great One. And I don't know where I land on that, because as Redgrave has asserted, and several other people as well, And as I've kind of come to believe myself, that Ebertos is closer to kin than she is to being a Great One. And the extent to which you can even make a simple division between kin and Great One is debatable. But if I recall correctly, I believe that Ebertos is susceptible to the kin damage type. So insofar as that actually means something in terms of the lore, which I think it does, then that would suggest, that would at least be one piece of evidence to suggest that Ebertos is in fact kin and not a Great One. And there's a whole other set of ideas that would support that, I believe, but that we're not going to be able to discuss until we get to Ebertos, which may be in this episode, but seeing as I've already been recording for as long as I have, it will probably have to wait for the next one. This is one of the nastier scripted moments in this game, I think. Because you're like, oh, this place, you know, it's pretty well lit. Doesn't look like there's that many enemies, but if you look up, you see a very different story. So yeah, then the level becomes a very different and much more eerie and scary place, in addition to the fact that it already was. Another interesting note is the music. The fact that, unlike the School of unlike Yahar'gul, the Unseen Village, when we visit there before the Blood Moon, when we hear the song Hail the Nightmare, we're not just hearing a song as part of the soundtrack. We are hearing a ritual that is currently being, the School of Mantis is currently trying to beckon the Nightmare. Trying to beckon the Nightmare of Mensis, or what eventually becomes the Nightmare of Mensis. And that's what we're hearing when we're hearing Hail the Nightmare. But here, unless there is literally a choir somewhere, singing this tune, singing this hymn, I guess you could say, I don't really know why we're hearing music here. I would love to pretend like I allowed that to happen, but I actually was trying to avoid that, so. We also have, as with many other places in the game, coffins here with body parts in them. But these don't appear to be nearly as cramped as those that we find on the streets of Yharnam. These appear to be maybe coffins of members of the choir, and of their families, because each one only seems to contain a single person. And this perhaps would be an urn? It can't be broken, unfortunately. But yeah, it's a very interesting little detail. And that some of them are actually metal, suggesting perhaps that their inhabitants mean something a little bit more than the others do. These things here. Could these be a reference to the baneful chanters? Because there weren't, and I'm sure someone has already made that connection. But yeah. Just based on how they look, that I could imagine very easily that that would be a early model of what the Baneful Chanters would have looked like before it became cut content, and then converted into the old hunters. Because other than the some of the beast enemies, I can't recall specifically what these ones are called, but other than the ones in Old Yarnum, who have the shrouds over their heads, we don't come across enemies at any other point in the game that do, other than the Baneful Chanters. And the ones who shoot the accursed brew at you. Blindfold Cap. Attire of the choir, high-ranking members of the Healing Church. Members of the choir are both the highest-ranking clerics of the Healing Church and scholars who continue the work that began at Byrgenwerth. The eye covering indicates their debt to the teachings of Master Willem, even though their paths diverged. So once again, recall that in one of the earliest episodes of this playthrough, we laid out in a chart like this the Byrgenwerth Schism. The reasons for which would appear to be not as clear as they once seemed, thanks in no small part to the DLC, which showed that the Healing Church, at least at one point in their history, was in fact doing something other than blood ministration, and that they may have, in a more direct way than we previously imagined, also have been trying to, just emulate what was being done at Byrgenwerth. That it wasn't all seek versus fear the old blood. That it was much more complicated than that. That it was more fluid. And that at various points, they may have been pursuing multiple lines of research, or maybe they even that blood ministration was one of the least favored ones. We don't really know, but there's certainly more evidence now to suggest that it may in fact be more complicated than just seek versus fear the old blood, which was the dichotomy we set up early on in this playthrough. Orphanage Key. Key to the Orphanage, birthplace of the choir. The Orphanage, shadowed by the Grand Cathedral, was a place of scholarship and experimentation, where young orphans became potent, unseen thinkers for the Healing Church. The choir that would later split into the Healing Church, or that would later split the Healing Church, was a creation of the Orphanage. So the let me think about this for a second, because I feel like this is circular. It's not circular, it's that it describes the Orphanage as the birthplace of the choir, but then it describes the Orphanage later in terms of that you would use to describe a person. That in the first instance, it's a place where one is born. In the second instance, it's that the choir was created by the Orphanage. So I wonder if that's just a case of really poor translation, because, it seems to be saying two different things at the same time. So this is one of the stranger moments in the game. That, yeah, there's this corpse here, and this is not the first time we've been given the option to quote-unquote talk to a corpse. Recall that when we entered the Forbidden Woods, for instance, the person guarding the door at the Forbidden Woods, we were given the option to talk to him before we discovered he was already dead. But the only thing that we're told here is... or in fact, not told anything, we're just given a gesture. Make contact gesture would seem to be a reference to, I don't know where this idea comes from specifically, but the idea is that if we were to ever come into contact with extraterrestrial beings, that, you know, the thought is that we would wave to them. And so you see this reflected in some, in pop culture mostly, but also in, you know, really scientific things, like the Voyager and, like the plaques that were affixed to the Voyager 1 and 2, and the Pioneer, I believe, 10 and 11 spacecraft, or space probes, all of which are at various points in leaving the solar system, depending on how you describe, how you define the solar system. And these plaques include, yeah, a series of basically hieroglyphs that attempt to, you know, in case these spacecraft are ever recovered by an extraterrestrial civilization, extraterrestrial out in space, because they are going to be, and they are, the first things in existence to have left, that humans have made to have left the solar system. And so if by some remote chance they come into contact with extraterrestrial beings, the idea was that we would attach, and Carl Sagan was central in a lot of this, that we would attach these plaques to these spacecraft, so that if an alien came across them, that they, if they were smart enough, if they understood mathematics, and that's a whole series of other things come out of that, like the assumption that we know this universal language that an alien would be able to understand, but I'm not going to get into that now. But basically the idea is that, you know, they look at this plaque, and they should be able to learn things about us on the basis of the key, which shows the hyperfine transition of hydrogen, and establishes that this is the key. So from the one state to the other state, that is 1 bit, and you see the little 1 at the bottom there. And then using that legend, that key, that they should theoretically, if they have an understanding of our conception of mathematics, that they should be able to read the rest of what's on this plaque, including a map of where the solar system is relative to a series of, I believe, 21 different pulsars, and that is spinning stars out in space. And also, you know, a series of other things about us, including this image of a man in the foreground and a woman kind of really slouched over in next to him, but somewhat in the background. That the man is holding up his hand. He's waving. And this is all very interesting to me. I hope it is for you too, because I've been talking about it for a while now. But one of the really interesting things about this is that they were originally conceived of as holding hands, and of course the whole thing is very binary in a way that, you know, is it's problematic in some ways. But again, I'm not going to get into the issues with it, just because there are plenty, and I would be here for a long time. But I do think that this is a really cool and a really admirable thing to do. But they were originally drawn as holding hands, but the idea was that the aliens might get confused, might confuse it for a single organism because they're holding hands. And so all of this is just to give you an idea of how vastly different an extraterrestrial being would likely be to us, because they evolved in completely, you know, literally an otherworldly planet. that may be completely and utterly different than us, and they may have evolved under evolutionary conditions that we don't have a chance of understanding at this moment. But, there's still this idea there that we can communicate with them with the laws of mathematics. And to bring it all back finally around to the make contact gesture, the idea is that rather than waving, because they could theoretically conceive of the wave as being an act of aggression, if we did something like this, which it makes the outline of a right-angled triangle, that, we would communicate to them that, hey, we understand mathematics. So whether or not our idea of mathematics is in fact a universal mathematics that an alien being would understand is another question entirely, but that's the idea behind this. And the Voyager and Pioneer spacecrafts, I think, are really good and really interesting real-world analogs to that. But so now that we've acquired that gesture, and so I was originally planning on not coming here until after we had completed the Nightmare of Mensis. But it occurred to me that I want to, one of the next things I want to do is I want to be able to explore the rest of the Chalice dungeons. The Is Gravestone and Tumaru Hill, specifically. But we can't do that until we have the Living String, and we won't be able to get a very important rune from the Brain of Mensis if we don't have the Make Contact gesture. So I figured it was smarter to come to the Upper Cathedral Ward first, so then we might do all these things in order without having to really backtrack all that much. Cosmic Eye Watcher badge. Badge of a member of the choir, elites of the Healing Church. The eye signifies the very cosmos. The choir stumbled upon an epiphany, very suddenly and quite by accident. Here we stand, feet planted in the earth. But might the cosmos be very near us? Only just above our heads? So, yeah, once again, raising questions about the extent to which the world of Bloodborne is stacked. And we've talked about this for several episodes in a row now, so I'm not going to go into it in very great depth, seeing as, again, we've already talked about it so much, but I do think that's very interesting. So recall that the ritual blood, and you can see based on the various levels, and so if you've never done a lot of Chalice Dungeon stuff, there are a lot of little things, and that's why we are going to do 1 or 2 more episodes on the Chalice Dungeons. But that if you have just ritual blood level 1 or 2, you don't really see certain things, but as you get deeper into the Chalice Dungeons, closer to, I guess, the Abyssal Cosmos, as I've conceived it, you see things like this, where it just looks like a normal thing of blood, but then you see these skulls coming out of it. Similarly with the tomb mold, you see it's just... But then you see the spores more and more, and that you see that the spores look almost like the cosmos. That there's a cosmos-type effect around them that we see throughout the game over and over again. And the exact same with the blooming cold-blood flower, the arcane haze. So it would seem that not only is the cosmos right above our heads and all around us, but also that, the cosmos or the abyssal cosmos, which may in fact be one in the same. And I believe there was a comment, I don't believe I saved it, and I apologize to whomever left it for that reason. But there was a comment that suggested that basically, it's not necessarily that there's an abyssal cosmos and then a cosmos. And that, I didn't really mean to suggest that, but I can see how it came across that way. And that the two may in fact be one and the same. Because in many ways, the cosmos is an abyss. That we exist in this game and in real life as, you know, beings on a planet, stacked or otherwise, spherical or otherwise, that is adrift in an abyssal cosmos. That's who we are. That's where we are, when we are. So earlier when I mentioned that we would be seeing another connection to the barnacles at the fishing hamlet, here we are. And these, in turn, are found in the research hall. And the fact that they're found in the research hall is another point in favor of what we discussed in the previous episode about the temporality of the DLC. Because if the two areas were contemporaneous, if they were around at the same time, then, you know, they wouldn't have had time in the research hall. Like, they wouldn't go there and then, you know, come back and say, like, within the next week, commission all of these statues placed around the research hall. The implication there is that the research hall is at a later time, you know, several years or maybe even decades after the fishing hamlet, or the events that originally took place there. So, why they're here, I'm not entirely sure, but it could just be in the same way that the Healing Church blindfold, the Healing Church cap, or the choir cap, is in the same way that that is a homage to Willem. This might be an homage to the research hall, which, if you'll recall, my position on the Lumenwood Gardens is basically that it was an earlier version of the Lumenflower Gardens. That it's very interesting. The layout is very, very similar, but that the garden itself is different. That the difference is seemingly only in the garden, what is planted there. But given their penchant to try and recreate things, it's not a stretch to me that, you know, if they're trying to continue the work that was being done at Bergenworth, it doesn't seem a huge stretch to me to suggest that they would reconstruct parts of this. Or maybe it's just that, again, the nightmare isn't necessarily supposed to make sense. A secret symbol left by Carol, runesmith of Bergenworth. Several runes relate to blood, including communion, which raises the maximum number of blood vials one may carry. This rune represents the healing church and its ministers. Blood ministration is, of course, the pursuit of communion. So again, we discussed this at great length when we were in Yosefka's clinic with respect to the Celestials. But yeah, Celestials are essentially represent attempts to commune with the Great Ones. But also that they, at least in that context, would seem to have been people who were, who had the beast taken out, the beast part of their blood taken out or eliminated somehow, such that they are no longer human. That when you take the beast out of the human, this is what you get. But what that view does not explain is how it is that they grow out of the ground here. Much like the living failures did. So could you almost look at it as like a DNA sequencing type thing, where they do the experiments maybe in order to sequence the DNA, and then somehow, and that's really anachronistic, so I don't really like going there, but and maybe not even saying DNA, but like they capture the essence of the being somehow, and then figure out how to grow them. I'm really not sure. But it's very, very interesting. And as always, I'm very much looking forward to hearing what each of you think about it. So as you may have already noted, this episode and the previous one are a fair bit shorter than those which preceded them. And that's due in parts to the fact that the DLC, I wanted to cover certain segments of the DLC in a single episode rather than splitting it up into, 7 or 8 different episodes. But also that Dark Souls 3 is fast approaching. And so I do want to make sure that I'm not rushing this series as we approach the Dark Souls 3 release date. I don't want this series to continue to linger at that point. I would like to, have it done in part, also once again, due to restrictions on my time, because I am going to be doing a blind playthrough of Dark Souls 3 in the same fashion that I did it for Bloodborne on this channel. And I won't be able to do that with any amount of regularity in terms of the uploads, because I would like to ideally upload an episode a day when the time comes for that. And yeah, that would be very difficult if I still had Bloodborne Let's Talk lore going on. And in addition to that, adding to my regular responsibilities outside of YouTube, I'm also currently planning my first ever lecture, so that's been a rather significant task. So I'm trying to keep these episodes shorter and more manageable so that I can continue to release them on a somewhat weekly basis, as close to a weekly basis as I can get, so that I can have it done on time for Dark Souls 3, and also so that I can keep them more manageable by making these shorter episodes, making them more manageable and easier to fit into my schedule. So with all that said, that also means that I'm not currently able to get to as many comments as I would like to, and while that's been true generally of the entire series, I'm really, really making an effort to limit myself here. And I hope you all understand the reasons for that. And so this also brings me to the first comment, which we received from Ben, who writes, "Put these on iTunes or something, please." And I probably should have replied with something a little bit more than a question mark, but I really wasn't sure what that was supposed to mean, and I guess Skizits, whose reply says, I think he's saying how these are almost like a podcast, that's a fair view, and I've had several people say that they like to have it on the background while doing other things, or, you know, that they listen to it like a podcast and they don't necessarily watch it. And I want to make myself perfectly clear that I'm 100% totally on board with that, because that's what I do with a lot of videos. And I often work, while I'm working, I often have videos on in the background, whether related to the Souls games or otherwise. And so, you know, far be it for me to criticize people for doing that with my videos. You can enjoy them in any way you want. But given the restrictions on my time, I hope you understand that, you know, I'm not going to go through the additional effort to convert it into a proper podcast and upload it to iTunes. And part of the reason for that, in addition to just the time constraints, is that you may have gathered, if you've been following this channel for a while, that I'm not the type of person to do things half-ass. That when I do something, I do it to the best of my ability, because otherwise I really don't see any point in doing things if you're not going to give it your all. And so with that said, were I to actually convert or create an alternative version of the series that could be put on iTunes, for me, I wouldn't be able to bring myself to simply just rendering a WAV or MP3 file and then uploading it there. Because, of course, there's a lot of stuff in the series that is visual. And, you know, a lot of moments, like in this week's episode especially, where I shut up and, you know, while editing, I boost the audio on the game volume and I walk around and look at things, or you know, I try to draw your attention to specific things that are happening on the screen. And so those are the types of scenes that I would have to do something with were I to officially convert it into a podcast. And yeah, that's just not something I'm able to do at this moment. And if you would really like to listen to the series as a podcast, then you are more than welcome to do that. There are a number of websites that you can go to. If you just Google YouTube to MP3 or something like that, there's a series of websites that will allow you to enter in a YouTube URL and then download the audio from it so that you can put it on your iPhone or whatever and listen to it later. Totally fine. 100% I'm on board with that. The next comment is from Logan Soulsborne, who writes, I don't know if either of these things are important, but I experienced a glitch a while back while in the Nightmare Frontier. I was opening a shortcut to patches and my character fell through the floor. After several minutes, he landed and died in space. I spawned in the Hunter's Dream. I then found my bloodstain in the Hunter's Dream on the storage box. Even in the game's code, the areas are vertical? So, yeah, this is something that is very interesting and does indeed raise questions about that. But it's something that, and it's fitting that I began the comments section of this episode by talking about wanting to wrap up this series before Dark Souls 3 begins, because I imagine it will be several years before, you know, we've come to a as full of an understanding as is possible of the game, its story, and its mechanics. And this is something that JSF and I talked about when he was on 2 episodes ago, but I don't believe it made it into the final cut. But just about how, you know, even today, we're still learning things about Demon Souls. But we do need to somehow get our hands on like a debug version of the game, or, you know, to figure out how to crack the PS4's encryption to be able to really dig into the game files. So this is very much an open question, I suppose. But one that, much like in Dark Souls 1, the geography of the game isn't necessarily consistent. And this is something that's a fair bit overdue. But I did want to give a shout out on this note to Brutus, who has a YouTube channel and a series of particular interest in this case called Lore Bites. And he had one of his episodes in that series. It's kind of a mini episode where he usually does more scripted stuff, but this one was a little bit more off the cuff, where he talks about the inconsistent geography in terms of Old Yarnum, how, you know, the path we have to take to get there versus the apparent proximity of Old Yharnam to the rest of Central Yharnam, or to the rest of Yharnam. And so, I highly recommend checking out this video in particular, given the current subject, but also his channel more generally. He has his Lore Bite series, but also another series called Lore Feast, which he's not uploaded an episode in about a month, I think, but I would highly recommend checking it out because, they're really well done. And as you all know, my position is such that I think everyone has their own valid, unique perspective on the lore. And so I certainly, far be it from me to, try to keep people here, because I think that, the more people we get in on this, the better. And Brutus's channel is certainly well worth checking out. Next we have a comment from Ite001, who writes that the Constable set says that only one survived being Valter. So I don't think Yamamura is one of the constables. However, he has clearly met Valter, and perhaps when he received the Impurity Rune, it drove him mad knowing of the Great One's words. And so, this is not an unfair point, but the Constable Garb says, specifically, that once upon a time a troop of foreign constables chased a beast all the way to Yharnam, and this is what they wore. The constables became victims of the beast, except for one survivor, who in turn devoured the creature whole, all by himself. So that second sentence in that first paragraph says, or could be read to say, several different things. So the constables became victims of the beast. To become victims of something or someone isn't necessarily to say that you died at the hands of that something or someone. And also, if you wanted to portray Valter as the sole survivor, then you'd be better off saying except for one sole survivor, or the sole survivor. Because by saying one survivor, you open up the possibility that there are other survivors, because otherwise why say one instead of sole? So it's not an unfair point, and that could very well be the case. Continuing on the subject of Yamamura, and I do want to point out, embarrassingly, that up until I was putting together, writing the timestamps for the previous episode, I've been saying Yanamura this whole time, Yanamura, but in fact it's Yamamura. So I apologize. No one's pointed that out yet, as far as I've seen, but yep, I felt really silly about that. The next comment comes from Dezo Penguin, who writes, I don't think that Yamamura could have been part of the troop of constables, both because of their highly divergent garb. If he was a constable, why not wear the uniform? And the fact that the constable's garb says that only one, presumably meaning Valter, survived. Rather, it seems more likely that it's a parallel experience. Like the constables, he pursued a beast to Yharnam, then joined up with the League, perhaps because Valter had a similar experience. Alternatively, it might be possible that he pursued independently the same beast for private revenge, that the constables pursued for official public justice. Though it would require that the world's pseudo-Japan had constables that adopted the uniforms of London bobbies. But hey, shades of the Meiji era? It could happen. His mantra fascinates me because I can see it coming from at least 3 different directions. That it's something that his Healing Church captors have forced him to repeat, that it's something that he clings to out of faith, that is, that the hunters clear of mind and of dedicated purpose as hunters are the true blades of the church, as opposed to the corrupt mad doctors, such as discussed in the Black Church garb, inhuman-looking church servants and the like that have him in prison, and that it's something that he clings to in accusation of his captors, slash those who drove him mad. Same meaning as before, but meant not to himself out of reassurance, but to his jailers to remind them of how they've strayed from the apparent principles they espouse, not knowing that those principles are a mere sham to mislead both the populace at large and even their own minions, for example, Ludwig. Finally, I wonder about his experiences, because he's both, as the trope says, gone mad from the revelation, and because he's been imprisoned by the church. Did these things happen simultaneously, or did he go insane and then as a madman blunder into the church and see too much? Or perhaps his League confederates brought him to the church for treatment, since they're the source of medical care in Yharnam, and his ravings gave him away and was then transported to be locked up. So many possibilities. Yep, so many possibilities indeed. And I've really not much to add because I really have no idea what to make of Yamamura. But thank you for, we had several comments about that, but and I appreciate them all. I'm very much appreciate the perspective that they've added, because there's a reason I didn't really say all that much about him, because I really don't know what to think about him. Next we have a comment from Zemeron, who writes, it's just my interpretation, but it seems to me that Brador isn't quite speaking as himself when you visit him in his cell. Brador is obsessed with the event where he killed his companion who turned into a cleric beast. So when you, a young hunter from a foreign land, likely the same foreign land he was from, enter his cell and he sees his younger self in you, and sees himself as his companion, the cleric beast whose skin he still wears. Thus when he says, "Are you going to kill me? After all you've done, kill me as if to right your wrongs?" he is kind of speaking of and to himself about his own sins of killing his companion. It would also fit well with his comment of, "Aren't you going to kill me, or perhaps beg my forgiveness?" since he would desperately desire forgiveness from his friend, yet expect things to take the same tragic turn as before. Also, the comment of "nothing changes, such as the nature of man," fits well, as in his death at your hands, he sees himself killing his friend once more. Anyways, I could be completely wrong, but I just thought I'd share my thoughts on it. And I very much appreciate that you did that, because that is a possibility that I have never considered before. We got a comment next from Reichsite, who writes, "Hi Aegon, I was wondering if maybe the hunter that drops the firing hammer badge is a Reverend Izzy. It's an interesting idea. I don't think I buy it. I'm still, I guess, partial to the idea that the bestial hunter is his name, at least according to the guide. I'm still partial to the idea that that's not necessarily supposed to be anyone in particular, but it's an interesting idea. And the whole Irreverent Izzy and his potential identity as the afflicted beggar, specter of which I raised earlier, is something that I'll try to remember for us to discuss in the next episode, because there's a fair bit of evidence in Yahargal, the Unseen Village, that would seem to suggest that Irreverent Izzy is, someone else, someone other than the bestial hunter. And we had another comment from Deso Penguin, who writes regarding Gina's comment on pronunciation from the previous episode. If anyone in this community is going to import the Bloodborne Design Works book releasing this month, the Japanese text should reveal the specific pronunciation. Since katakana, unlike kanji and unlike our Latin alphabet in English, always has single specific pronunciations, it would be simple to see if it starts with a hard T. Actually, since there's no TH sound in Japanese, I think we may find that Gina was right, even though I've been pronouncing it the other way all along like you. And on that note, we also had a comment from JSF, who writes that Gina's pronunciation of Tumaru is actually the way it's written in the original script. So very, very interesting. So you may have caught earlier in the episode when I mentioned Tumaru that I stuttered for a second. I was about to say Thumaru, but then I paused and said Tumaru. And the reason for that is these two comments. And so, once again, adding to what Gina said in the comment we discussed in the previous episode. So if you're still watching, Gina, thank you very much for that. Very interesting, and really kind of reinforces the ideas that were presented therein. Idoff Brad writes, "I noticed the item description for the eye pendant states that there are 2 cathedrals in the Hunter's Dream. Could this be a typo and the developers meant to say the Hunter's Nightmare? Perhaps to the player character the area we are in is a nightmare, but to the blood-drunk hunters it is a dream, as they can hunt beasts till the end of time." And when I looked again at the eye pendant, because I believe there was another comment that raised this issue as well, and it's not one that I noticed at all, but it does indeed say there are 2 cathedrals in the Hunter's Dream. Once again, I would kindly throw this out to those of you who have the ability to figure out whether there might be a translation issue here, because if there's not, I really have no idea what to make of this. Yeah, I honestly don't know. I guess if it's not a translation issue, the only thing I could think of is that the implication there might be that the Hunter's Nightmare is part of, the same dreamland as is the Hunter's Dream. But that raises a whole whole series of other questions that we unfortunately don't have the time to discuss in the context of this particular episode. But I am very interested to hear what everyone thinks about that and everything else, and that we discuss over the course of this episode. So thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.